Hey everyone, it's Ben from Rotoshift Lab, and today I'm going to walk you through some testing I did on my leash setup and how well it releases under tension. This isn't going to be your typical gear review or comparison, so take everything I say here with a grain of salt. Really, what you should do is apply some of these ideas to your own leash setup and decide whether or not you can test your setup and whether or not that testing, how that testing turns out, decide whether or not your leash meets your needs in the river. My leash setup consists of a badfish release connected to a ring on my Rescue PFD that has a releasable chest harness on it. It also has a knife on it that I can use to cut the leash itself. Now, this Rescue PFD has been modified a little bit to suit my needs. The ring here that I clip the release to usually goes in the middle of the back, and you can see I moved it to my side because I would like where the release connects, I'd like this to be easily accessible. I don't want to be reaching behind my back. The other thing I did is this release buckle is typically on the left hip. I moved it to the right hand side because I'm goofy and I want the leash to connect off my left hip towards the back of the board. It also gives me the ability to release my leash from either side of my body. In theory, if I had an issue where I could only use one arm, hopefully I have one of the two releases that I can reach. For my tests, I rigged up a pulley system that would put tension on my leash setup, and I tried releasing both of my systems at various amounts of force. I had it set up to release under 4 pounds, 9 pounds, 25 pounds, 43 pounds, and then I just decided to put my whole body weight on the system, so I set it up so I could hang off of it and put my full 160 pounds on the leash system. And with that, I discovered a couple of things about each of my release setups, both the chest harness on my PFD as well as a release. I'll talk about the chest harness first. I discovered that under light tension, so 4 and 9 pounds, pulling my chest harness didn't result in it actually fully releasing. There wasn't enough tension in the system to pull this strap through the buckle, through this metal buckle, and then through each of these sewn loops and release all the way through the system. You can even see here it's taking a bit of force for me to pull this whole thing through. Now, this PFD can be set up to provide different amounts of friction, and I choose to run my strap through the metal buckle and then through the plastic lever. And I do that because I personally have found if I do anything less than that, so for example, if I just ran the strap through the plastic buckle by itself, I found that this strap will work itself loose over the course of a surf session. So I've decided to add a little bit more friction. But the result is, under low tension, this will not release me from the board. Under higher tension, so 25 and 43 pounds, this system worked fine. I was able to pull the release and the whole thing slid out and released me from the leash system. And also when I put my full body weight on it, 160 pounds, I found that I didn't have any problem pulling this tab and releasing me from the system. So I learned that using this release in a system where there's not a lot of tension put on the leash, so if I'm swimming with my board, maybe I'm swimming downstream and I see either a strainer or I see a situation where my board is going to go around one side of a rock and I'm going to go around the other side of the rock, and I want to get away from my board and my leash before I get into that situation, this chest release might not work for me just because there's no tension in the system yet. If I'm in a situation where something's already trapped and all of a sudden there's a ton of force on my leash, this is going to work for me. Otherwise, I shouldn't be using this. For the releash, I tried the same tests. I started off by just seeing if I could release it with no tension system, and it turns out this works fine. The tension that you create is from the point where it connects to your PFD and the ball pole itself. And between those two things, this will release even if there's no tension in the rest of the leash. It also releases fine at 4 pounds, 9 pounds, 25 pounds, 43 pounds. It did fine at releasing at those amounts of force in the system. I did notice though that it got harder and harder to pull this pin as the amount of force went up. And once I put my full body weight into the system, I found that pulling this pin, especially with just one hand, became very difficult. And if you look at the way this leash is set up, it becomes pretty intuitive why more tension in the system will result in a harder release pull. The tension ends up being perpendicular to the direction you need to pull the release. So the more tension you put this way, the more friction is going to be put on the pin that releases the system. And this isn't something that's unique to just the Badfish release. Ocean leashes that have a release pin have the same problem. The force that's being put on by the leash and by your board ends up being perpendicular to the direction you need to pull the release. So the more force that you have on this leash, the harder it's going to be to pull that pin in a perpendicular direction. The other thing that I discovered with the Badfish release is that this key ring that connects the shackle to the pull tab can come unscrewed in versions of this leash that were made in 2023 or earlier. This issue doesn't happen in brand new releases that were made this year. But previous versions, this ring could come partly unscrewed, and you could get into a situation where the amount of force that you have to pull on the tab causes the ring itself to fail. The 2024 versions of the release don't have this problem because they weld this ring together so it can't come unscrewed and won't fail at such a low force. The other thing that I learned when doing research for this testing is that both the carabiner at the end of the release as well as the sewn webbing right here is designed to fail at 300 pounds of force. So if you're in a situation where there's that much force being pulled on this leash, one of these two things should fail on you. The thing I'm not sure on is there an amount of force between the 160 pounds that I tested in my system and 300 pounds where the whole system will fail, that the pin itself becomes too difficult to pull because there's so much force on the pin from the leash. The last thing I tested was actually pulling my knife and cutting the leash itself, and this turned out to be surprisingly easy. It turns out once you start to cut the leash, the whole thing fails catastrophically. You don't have to saw at it or try very hard to cut it. Once the slightest nick happens on the leash, the whole thing just fails. After all this testing, personally, I feel confident that in a situation where my board or my leash was entangled in the river, I would be able to release myself from it. I definitely have to keep in mind that my chest harness will not release under low tension situations, and potentially the Badfish release is going to get harder and harder to release under high tension situations. But I believe with the combination of those two, I have a good chance of releasing myself from that system. And in the worst case, learning that it's very easy to cut a leash with a knife is great peace of mind. The one thing that I would recommend to anyone using a release is that they upgrade to the latest version that has this welded ring, just so you don't end up in a situation where this ring itself fails. There still needs to be a bunch more testing of leashes in the river. I would like to know, how much force is actually exerted on the leash if a board gets stuck, if a person gets stuck and the board's downstream, or other scenarios. How does water affect these release mechanisms? Does it make it easier? Does icing make it harder? Things like that. If you do any tests like this, please let me know how those turn out. I'd love to hear about them and what you've tried. And stay safe out there. Test your leashes.